Hello everyone, Jarno here and welcome to an F1 sim racing masterclass where we're going to go into the depths of braking, throttle, ideal racing lines and maybe a little bit of setup work for those who are interested in getting the maximum out of their Formula 1 car. One massive mistake a lot of people make that are not very much into racing is using their right foot to brake. Of course, in Formula cars you want to use your left foot to brake. In this era of Formula 1, there's not a single driver in Formula cars anymore that uses their right foot to brake, simply due to the fact you got a little bit of coasting going on in between going full throttle and your braking point, and that loses you lap time. Of course, in this era of Formula cars, you don't need to use the clutch anymore to downshift, so your left foot is basically there just to brake. And yeah, that will gain you around 2-3 tons per lap for sure. Then on to hard braking zones. We're talking about turn 1 Bahrain, turn 1 Monza, second last corner in China, very tight hairpin of course. The basic is that you want to press the brake pedal as hard as you can without locking up. You might have to adjust brake bias a little bit for that, but you want to put full braking pressure and hold the braking pressure there for a bit until the downforce comes off the car as you slow down. Of course, F1 cars have got a huge amount of downforce, so you want to brake as hard as you can and then hold it there, and as the downforce goes off you start bleeding off the brakes, and that is the hard part, to not lock up in that phase where you're bleeding off the brake. Simply due to the fact that the F1 car loses so much downforce and the brakes are so strong that it's just so easy, especially if you start turning in, to lock up the inside tire for turn 1 Monza, Bahrain, and the second last corner in China, that is the right front. And yeah, it is just very easy to lock up in the late zone of the brakes, especially because they get so hot as well. So you might lose a little bit of feeling for the pedal, especially as the race goes on. To avoid lockups when you turn into a corner, it's very important to get a good feeling for trail braking. This is why having a load cell is so important. You get a feeling for how much pressure you have to put on the brake pedal in order not to lock up. Now, of course, this changes again in a lot of scenarios, weather, setup, etc. As you get more experience, grow more experience, get a better feel through a load cell, you get better at this. And the fact that with the Heusinkveld pedals you can change the brake shape, for example. So if you're really struggling with those lockups as you're trail braking, you could change the brake shape to perhaps slightly less aggressive, so your actual output is slightly less for the same amount of pressure. Those are all things you can consider and have to practice in order to avoid those late entry lockups. So the difference in brake pressure between the wet and the dry is obviously that in the wet you're gonna have less brake pressure, and you're probably gonna be holding the brakes for a lot longer. The braking distance is longer, of course, depending on how long the straight before was. There are obviously scenarios where you can brake at a similar point because your exit speed in the previous corner was like so much lower. But if we're still talking about the long braking zones like T1, Bahrain, Monza, or the second last corner in China, the braking distance is going to be much longer. And yeah, again, you're going to have to change brake bias probably a little bit to the rear for the wet. It depends per game as well, of course. On the F1 game you have to go to the front actually in wet conditions, but in real life they will go to the back or perhaps change brake migration as well. So yeah, less brake pressure in the wet, of course, especially less peak pressure. I think Formula 1 cars are very much built around dry conditions and not around wet conditions. So braking for high speed and medium speed corners is obviously very different to hard braking zones like turn 1 Monza or the second last corner in China. You cannot hit a brake pedal too hard into a corner like last move 1 and last move 2 of Monza, due to the fact you most likely lose the backhand, especially if you're running a fast setup. You will lose the backhand if you pitch the car too much. So you just want to like kind of glide the brake pedal as you go into the corner, ideally a little bit earlier on, so you don't pitch the car when you're already turning, because the rear tires will give up mid-corner if you're too aggressive on the trail braking late on, again with a fast setup. And yeah, this is why you see very fast drivers sometimes, like Lewis or Charles on their qualifying laps, holding the throttle as they go through a corner slightly by like 10% to keep the back end stable. That's obviously a very risky way to drive, because it's very easy to lose the back end. If you just forget to put slightly not enough throttle, you will lose the back end. It is obviously a very, very fast way to drive, but a very risky one. So for high speed corners, if you've got a lot of understeer, you can be aggressive on the brake pedal, but if you're running a very oversteery setup, you're gonna have to be gentle on that brake pedal, keep the back end stable and carry the speed throughout the corner and maximize your lap time. So going into the second last corner in China, very hard braking zone. You want to brake around 100 meters, could be a little bit earlier, could be, I don't think a lot later, to be honest. It's very high speed. I think you're reaching top speeds of around 340 kph on the top of my head into the second last corner of China. You want to hit the brakes as hard as you can until you start turning the car. So you want to hold the peak pressure for really long. But once the car really starts to slow down, let's say under 160, 170 kph, you really want to start bleeding off the brakes. Bleeding the brakes in is just slowly getting off that last bit of brake, depending on how the car reacts, and then start turning into the corner. And yeah, carry as much speed as possible so you don't have to make that speed on the exit again. So it's such a tight corner that you don't go too deep, because you will sacrifice a lot of minimum speed, and just a few kilometers of minimum speed in such a slow speed corner will lose you so much lap time. So you want to make sure that you get the car stopped down and carry the speed into a corner. At the same time, if you're too early, you lose that wall braking zone lap time. So yeah, it's a balancing act. Like everything in racing, it's a balancing act. In comparison to a heavy braking zone, let's say the second last corner of Bahrain, turn 13, you do not want to hit the brake pedal as hard in a light braking zone. You kind of want to bleed the brakes into the corner, and a lot about a corner like that, you're just using the brake pedal to balance out the car. So of course you need to get the car slowed down. You're still gonna have a peak pressure, but it's obviously not going to be smashing the brake pedal as hard as you can. And it's a lot about that last phase of the braking zone, where if you hit the brake pedal too hard, you're most likely going to lose the back end. I think you very often see in real F1 practice sessions where drivers lose the back end in a corner like that. For that exact reason, they're trying to push the limits on how hard they can trail brake into a corner like that, to rotate the car as much as they can, or see how much speed they can carry before the back tires give up if they're running like a risky setup, and really try to get as much rotation as possible. Then they cannot push the brake pedal that hard, simply due to the fact they will lose the back end in a corner like that. Of course, it's very long. You're on the brakes for quite a while, all the time you're turning, so the back end can get a little bit light on the entry there. So now on to acceleration. A lot easier in my opinion than braking. You have to be really smooth on the power, not get too much slip out of corners, even though having a tiny bit of slip on tires is faster, depending again on what tires you're running. But yeah, driving around with a little bit of slip is always going to be faster, but you can't, because the tires will wear out too fast. They will overheat, so you have to be a lot more smoother in the race, for example, than you have to be in qualifying. One very common mistake people make in F1 cars is accelerating out of tight corners in first or second gear. This generation of Formula 1 cars has over 1000 horsepower and an incredible amount of torque. 8 gears as well. Coming out of a corner like turn 1 and 2 Monza, it's a lot easier, especially for a beginner, to just use third or fourth gear. Because the car has so much power, you won't lose as much lap time using fourth gear, for example, which would be really easy. I reckon third gear would be the fastest. But yeah, if you're struggling with those traction zones, just go up a gear or short shift into next gear to help you be more stable on those exits, build confidence, because using first gear or second gear is not something really even the best of the best do, because you kill that momentum mid-corner. So if you get into a situation where you have to lose the backhand on corner entry, or your tire starts slipping and you're starting to lose the car on an exit, it might sound weird, but the best thing to do is not completely come off throttle, especially in F1 cars that have got so much engine braking to help regenerate the battery. It's actually best to keep a tiny bit of throttle, which keeps the weight to the back of the car. At the same time, it's hard to balance out, of course, because if you keep too much throttle with a car that has over 1,000 horsepower, the rear tires just keep spinning, you keep sliding. But the best thing to do, even if you're in your road car, if you start losing the backhand, is to keep a tiny bit of throttle, just to keep weight on the back, because the second you hit the brakes, the car dives to the front and all the weight of the rear is gone and you will definitely spin. So best thing to do, keep a tiny bit of throttle on, and perhaps a tiny bit of brake. You cannot slam the brake because, as I just said, all the weight will go to the front of the car, and yeah, it's basically like pressing your front brake on your bike as hard as you can. All the weight goes off the rear and there's no weight on the rear tires anymore. So the hard part about this masterclass on acceleration is that the corner exits are all very situational. It all depends on how you approach the corner initially. It changes per car, per tire, per engine, per track, per corner. Depends on track temperature, and that's what's so hard about racing anyway. Everything is so situational. If you're changing a tiny thing on the setup, it changes the entire way you have to drive a car. And I think that's what makes the difference between the very best and the average drivers, is that they can instantly adapt and be on it whatever changes on track or on their setup or on their car. So yeah, I can not tell you the exact points where you have to brake, where you have to go on throttle, because even for me, someone who practices thousands of hours on the simulator, for me it's not going to be the same every lap, and that's something you have to accept. There's not one way of how to drive, because it changes every single lap. So on to steering now then. A very basic tip I'm going to give is keep your steering wheel as straight as possible when braking and accelerating. I know that's not always possible in certain types of corners that are very long and prolonged, but obviously when you're braking for a hairpin, you want to keep your car completely straight to maximize braking performance, and the same for corner exits. Try to keep your wheel as straight as possible to maximize the grip on the rear tires. So for Formula 1 cars, you kind of never want to leave your hands off the steering wheel. You always want to hold it like this. There are scenarios like for the Monaco hairpin, for example, where you kind of have to push the steering wheel around and kind of, yeah, both hands get in a very uncomfortable position. But that's just necessary to get around the corner basically. But in general, you always want to hold your steering wheel. Even if you go for 180 degrees, you always hold your steering wheel with both hands. You never, like in a real car, want to grab it over. Sometimes when people start playing F1 and they got the wrong steering wheel rotation set, they have to grab the wheel over, but that's very bad and will lose you a lot of lap time, because you're just spending time turning the wheel rather than being on the limit of the front tire. So very important to set your steering wheel rotation correct and hold your steering wheel with both hands. So brake bias on the Formula 1 game. You want to move forward for very heavy braking zones, and you want to move all the way backwards for high-speed corners. This is just to help rotation in high-speed corners and not lock the rear tires in heavy braking zones. So in general, I use around 56% brake bias for hairpins, and then for high-speed corners I use 50. Now for everything in between, you can go from 50 to 56, of course. Now if you're very new to the F1 game, I would just suggest sticking it on 56 and not changing it. Now brake bias gets a lot more complicated when you get into games like iRacing or Assetto Corsa, where brake migration is involved and you have to change the engine brake as well. The difficult thing is that wind, for example, already might change the way you have to set up your brake bias. Now, if you're not fully on the limit, you can kind of get away with just one setting, but if you want to be esports level, you have to be changing it non-stop in order to be on the absolute limit of the car. So differentials in Formula 1 car, you got the entry diff, which is obviously for the entry of the corner. Then you got mid, which is for mid corner. And then you've got the high-speed diff, which is basically for when you're full throttle. And yeah, that's basically dictates how your exit is going to be, but also how your high-speed performance is going to be. And now this might change per team, per Formula 1 car, of course. Basically, what the differential does, it allows the inside tire and the outside tire to move at different speeds, which helps rotate the car around the corner and to go faster around the lap. Now, let's say you drive off the start. You want both tires to be completely locked and move at the same speed, because if they're not locked enough, you might get into a situation where one starts spinning, and then obviously you lose all the drive and you lose a lot of lap time. So that's not what you want. And for cornering, of course, you want it to be as open as possible so you get around the corner. But then again, let's say you've got a diff that's too open on the entry. Under braking, you might lock the inside tire because there's not enough force. And yeah, then you kind of lose all drive as well. You have to just try these things out yourself, really understand what they do, and then see what you like to change depending on what corner you're heading into. So let's take the last corner in Monza, for example, Parabolica. You want the differential to be as open as possible, simply because it's a high-speed corner. You don't need a lock diff. You want the diff to be as open as possible. There's not really a chance of the inside tire locking or spinning up anyway, because yeah, you don't have enough torque going on throttle to spin the inside tire anyway, and the braking force is not high enough to lock the inside tire. So you want it to be as open as possible and have both tires to move as freely as possible in order to carry as much speed as possible. And at the same time, the brake bias, you want to move it slightly back in order not to lock up the front. So it's not very likely to happen anyway, but on the F1 game, for example, you want the brake bias to be as far enough back, because you cannot change the entry and mid diff before you head into that corner. So you want as much rotation as possible going through a high-speed corner like that. Yeah, so of course, this is a lot of information to process, especially when you're driving. Now, you kind of want to know what you're going to change per corner before you head into a run or into a qualifying lap. So you don't have to think about all of this when you're driving, and then you can analyze this afterwards. Now, of course, what you also can do is just leave the brake bias on a set position, leave the differential on a set position, same for engine brake, and just drive. Especially when you're new to racing, you're probably better off just changing one thing at a time and not every corner. This is very much esports level and pro level that I'm explaining right now, and this is for the people who want to get to the next step. So setting up your rig is obviously very important in sim racing to get it right. One important rule I try to follow myself is I will not start practicing until I've got the rig exactly how I want to, simply because there's no point in practicing in a way that you don't like the rig or you're not comfortable, because you're kind of just messing up your muscle memory, driving in a way you don't want. So what I always do, I completely set up the rig, even if it takes a complete day of my time. I will not start practicing until I exactly have it the way I want, because there's no point. You're just wasting time. Especially the brake pedal, very important to set the force and sensitivity in a way you are comfortable, because the brakes, I reckon, are the most sensitive to muscle memory. For example, on iRacing, I increase the force because it's a lot easier to lock up. And yeah, if you, let's say, keep the force from Formula 1, where you have to press almost 100% on every braking zone, and you move to iRacing, where you keep the force the same, but you lock up a lot easier. So you kind of have to brake at around 60% most of the time. I increase the force on iRacing by like 10 kg, for example. So I have to adapt slightly less, if that makes sense. So an advanced tip I can give to people using Heusinkveld Smart Control is of course changing the brake shape, the throttle shape and the clutch shape in order to get more comfortable in a certain car you're driving. Or let's say you're moving from qualifying to the race, you can make the throttle shape slightly less sensitive to help you get those exits and not initiate wheel spin as fast as possible. Now, me myself, I always like to keep a linear throttle and brake shape, but I know a lot of other sim racers, for example in iRacing or rFactor 2, that do like to change their brake or throttle shape to get them more comfortable in the car they're driving. So it's definitely an option you need to consider in order to maybe get a little bit more comfortable with the pedals you're using. So that was our F1 Sim Racing Masterclass. We went over a lot of different topics: braking, steering, throttle, some simple tips, but also some more advanced tips, how to extract more out of your equipment, out of your pedals. Make sure to rewatch the topics we went over if you haven't quite understood them yet, to extract more lap times out of your qualifying and race. And maybe I'll see you on the F1 Sim Racing grid in the coming years.